Tracy is from Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. Most of you all know as FSANZ. She is a senior person there working in dietary exposure assessment. So she is very, very familiar with dietary data. She has worked in the Australian National Survey data collections, and she's also been very involved in inputting New Zealand data into the dietary modelling tools used by FSANZ. So she understands New Zealand data as well. We're very lucky to have Tracy here. She's a wealth of knowledge. So Tracy.
Kia ora, or should I say g'day. It's been about 14 years since I've been in Dunedin. I first came in 2001, and I remember at that time meeting Jim and his team and talking at that time about the work they were doing on folic acid. I then came back in 2005 and met with Winsome and Nola and the group in the LINZ unit to discuss the 2002 Children's Survey, because at that time we were thinking about using that for our risk assessment work at FSANZ, so I came to find out a little bit more about that. So thank you for having me back. So I know there are a couple of other Aussies in the audience. So what exactly do Australians eat? So we all have our ideas in our head, whether it's something like Vegemite, meat pies, beers, sausage sandwiches, pavlova, lamingtons, Tim Tams. But what is it in reality? And what is in our foods that we eat? And is it safe to consume? So all of these sorts of things, food and nutrition monitoring data can help us answer. There are a lot of questions for policymakers and regulators. Is the food supply adequate and accessible to all? Is the composition of food changing, and will changes increase or decrease our risk of diet-related diseases? Are food habits changing, and how? Are there different risks for different population groups or subgroups? What about food supplements? Who takes them, and what's the impact on nutrient intakes? And did implementing a policy or program make a difference? So these are all things that a really good data set is needed to answer. So today I'm just going to touch a little bit on a brief history of food and nutrition monitoring in Australia, talk some about our food composition program, food chemical surveillance, our national nutrition surveys, and Australian data for risk analysis in the international context, and summing up at the end. So in terms of a brief history of food and nutrition monitoring in Australia, it's been quite piecemeal. There's been no coordinated approach and no central coordinating agency. There have been different bits and pieces done by the Department of Health, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, our Department of Agriculture, FSANZ, state and territory departments, and other organisations. Our last national nutrition policy was in 1992, so that's 27 years ago now. In 1994, there was a good summary done by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare about Australia's food and nutrition data. In 1998 to 2001, we had a food and nutrition monitoring unit, and this was a group of experts working in the area to look at what data are available. They looked at some trends over time, and they also did some further analysis of our 1995 National Nutrition Survey. But of course, funding meant that that didn't progress. In 2000, we had our National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Nutrition Strategy and Action Plan launched. In 2006, there was a business case for a national food and monitoring system, and this was referred to as the Nexus Report, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. In 2012, we had an updated version of the Australia's food and nutrition data, and for Australians, this is a really good summary of the information that's available in our country. So what about a new national food and nutrition policy? There is some information on the Department of Health website that a new policy is being investigated and consultations are going to take place. But this information is quite a few years old now and hasn't been updated very recently at all, so I guess we will wait and see. There is a lot of push for it in the nutrition and public health space in Australia. So it's a history of some national nutrition and health surveys, and I'll go into the nutrition surveys a little bit later. There's been a few of those. In 83, 85, 89, we had the Heart Foundation risk factor prevalence surveys. There were some physical activity surveys conducted. We've had the AusDiab cohort study, which has looked at things like diabetes, chronic disease, blood pressure and smoking. We've had a few health surveys on national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And our health surveys are those that collect information on things like chronic disease, medication use of hospitals, mental health, and those sorts of areas. And from 1977 onwards, every 3 years, we've had a National Health Survey on the general Australian population. And this is conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So this is one of our most long-term rolling data sets, so it's a really important data set in the history of Australian health. So the Nexus Report was put together by a consortium of people, experts in the area of food and nutrition monitoring. And to put this together, they did a lot of consultation with experts and stakeholders. They come up with 4 key elements that are needed in a national food and monitoring system. And that's finding out information about the food supply. How do we get the food that we eat? Food purchasing and acquisition behaviours. So where do we get our food and where is it consumed? Food and physical activity behaviours. So what are we actually eating and what activity do we do? And the nutritional status of the population. So within this report, they actually produced some funding estimates as well. But one of the key conclusions that they made was that we need a rolling, ongoing program of food and nutrition monitoring in Australia. And of course, we haven't seen that as yet. At FSANZ, we monitor the food supply in an ongoing way for a number of different reasons. Firstly, to determine the impact of a major regulatory or policy decision on public health and safety, to evaluate known food-related risks on the basis of an ongoing or planned schedule, so we have some surveys that we do routinely, or as a result of a food incident or an emerging issue, something that might come up in Europe, for example, and we don't have any data, so we might have to have a look at that. We do it on a wide range of food chemicals, so not just in the nutrient space. So we look at things like pesticides, contaminants, food additives, and microbiological issues as well. So we can collect survey data on some of that, and in some cases do dietary modelling to estimate exposure or intake to some of those food chemicals or microbes. I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about our food composition program in Australia. And this is undertaken by FSANZ, and we're responsible for compiling our nutrient composition data sets. We have 2 key data sets, the first one being the Australian Food Composition Database, and this is our reference database. And some of you who are familiar with our data may know the name NUTTAB, and that was what we were referring to as our reference database previously. But when we did some consultation with stakeholders about what they would like to see in the Australian Food Composition Database, some people were a bit confused about the name and what it actually meant. So what we've done is we've renamed our reference database. So NUTTAB is no longer, and we now have what's called the Australian Food Composition Database. And version 1 of that was released in January last month. So that's what you'll see from now on. Our other data set is what we call AusNut, and that's our nutrition survey specific database. So that's based on what people actually consumed as part of the nutrition surveys. All of the food composition data also feeds into our nutrition panel calculator, and this is something we have on our website for food industry to use to enable them to produce nutrient information panels to go on packaged food. So it includes the mandatory nutrients that they need to put on their labels. We've done 22 analytical programs since 2010, covering 325 different foods. So these have been to pick up information on key foods, so where we know the main foods that Australians eat, we want to have updated data on those. Any new foods or where analytical methods may have changed and we want to get some updated data. We also receive data from stakeholders, and this might be the food industry or researchers. So you can submit data to FSANZ, and we evaluate that and determine what and how we will include that in the nutrition composition data sets. And we have a custom developed computer program that we call Silo that compiles all the Australian data. So in the Australian Food Composition Database, our reference database, we have about 1,500 foods and beverages, and it's primarily based on analytical data, so good quality information. There are 54 nutrients for every food, and that's based on what we produce for our national nutrition surveys. There can be up to 256 components with information. Don't ask me to name all those because I won't be able to. We have updated data for some new foods, so things like gluten-free flour, green tea, amaranth, oat milks and things like that are now in the data set. We have data available now based on common measures. So traditionally our food composition data was always produced per 100, or shown per 100 grams. So now you'll be able to see, well, what's the nutrient profile per tub of yogurt, for example. We've introduced a new classification system, and it more closely aligns with what the National Nutrition Survey classification system is to make things a bit more comparable. And from now on, each food will have a unique code to identify it. So moving forward, you can track foods more easily across the data sets. So full-fat milk will always have the same code. The databases you can search on the FSANZ website, so if you're looking for specific nutrients, or you can download all the files and work with them. And there's information on the foods, the nutrients, the recipes that we use to compile the data sets, retention factors and measures. So just some examples of some of the key monitoring we've done in the food composition space. Based on the introduction of mandatory and folic acid and iodine fortification in 2009, we've conducted 3 analytical programs on bread, so 2010, 12 and 13. And from that we've been able to check that the fortification is in the breads and also estimate population intakes. And we fed all that information to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, who were doing a review of all of the effectiveness of the fortification programs. And what they've shown is that neural tube defects in Australia have decreased by 14% in the Australian general population, but by up to 74% in the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population, so that's quite significant. Also, the iodine intakes have increased by 50% in women of childbearing age and up to about 30% in children, so shown to be very effective. There's also some policies in Australia around reducing sodium levels in foods, and so we've done some analytical programs in 2008, 9 and 2011 and also collected some industry data on sodium levels in food. The Department of Health coordinates the Healthy Food Partnership, and this is work with government and the food industry and public health to try and reduce sodium levels in certain foods to specific targets. So based on this information, we're able to model the impact of sodium reduction on population intakes. For trans fatty acids, we've conducted 3 analytical programs in 2005, 2009 and 2013. We've estimated intakes for Australia and New Zealand and compared those to the World Health Organization limit of less than 1% of energy from trans fats. Some time ago there was some discussion that we need mandatory trans fat labelling on all the nutrition information panels. And based on the work that we've done in our analytical data, we can show that trans fat levels have been coming down over time, particularly in things like margarines. And when we estimated the intakes in the population, Australia was about 0.5% of energy and New Zealand was about 0.6%, so around half the WHO limit. We also showed that the major contributor was ruminant or naturally occurring sources, so it wasn't the processed foods. So based on all of that, we were able to say, well, mandatory labelling on the nutrition information panel is probably not warranted, but we'll continue to do those voluntary initiatives through the industry to decrease levels. So now moving from nutrients to other food chemicals, and we use that as a global term to capture things like our pesticides, contaminants and food additives. Food chemical surveillance in Australia is done, some of it by FSANZ, but also in a collaborative approach with other state and territory governments and other organisations within Australia. And we also work closely with New Zealand in terms of MPI with some surveillance work in the food chemical space. In FSANZ we have the Australian Total Diet Study, and traditionally this was done collecting information on pesticides and contaminants. And we were continually showing consistent good results from this survey. So we had to justify its existence and so that we could keep the funding going for this particular survey. So we ended up broadening the scope of that to include things like food additives, nutrients, and a broader range of contaminants other than the mercury, lead, arsenic that we were looking at. And it really helped us fill some of the data gaps for risk assessments that we were undertaking that we didn't have any information for. We've also done other monitoring surveys where we need some information, and there have been things like on packaging, food colours, dioxins and other contaminants such as pHs and PBDEs. At the broader food regulatory level, there's the Surveillance, Evidence and Analysis Working Group that sits under ISFRA, so the Implementation Subcommittee for Food Regulation. And this is a group of state and territory governments and also New Zealand, and they put together the Coordinated Food Survey Plan. So they meet around 4 times a year, twice face-to-face and twice by teleconference, and come up with a priority list of things that they need to get some information on. So within that survey, the survey plan, they've collected information on things like plasticizers, the trans fatty acids come into that, sulfites, cyanogenic glycosides like you find in cassava, and microbiological surveys. And the micro area is not one of my areas of expertise, so I'm not going to talk about that today, but just to make a note that the coordinated survey plan itself and all of the results from all of the surveys conducted under it are on the FSANZ website. So to touch on our total diet study in a little bit more detail, because it's one of our key monitoring surveys, it's done approximately every 2 years, and depending on what we're analysing and the budget we've got available, we usually survey around 110 foods, and they're collected from all over Australia. And we tend to collect a few more samples for what we call regional foods, so foods that we might expect a bit more variation in the contaminant or component that we're looking at. So that might be things like milk, cheese, meats, things that are more locally produced and sold. And we get a few less samples for things that are what we call national foods that might be centrally processed in one factory and distributed across Australia. So things like breakfast cereal might be a good example of that. The important thing in the total diet study is that everything is prepared to a table-ready state. So meat is cooked. So when the foods are analysed, it then gives a really close and accurate estimate of the level of the food chemical that people are actually going to be exposed to. And for something like sulfites, that's been really important when we included that, because manufacturers might put this much in the food, and then over time, as it does its preservative job, it slowly decreases, and then when you cook it, it might decrease even more. So having foods prepared on that table-ready state for something like that was really important. So our 25th ATDS is on pesticides and contaminants, and we'll be releasing the results from that soon. The 26th ATDS is also in the field, and we're doing dioxins and dioxin-like PCBs. The last time we looked at dioxins was in around 2004, so again this is one of the rolling sort of monitoring programs that we wanted to go back and have a look at, well, what's the current status of exposures to dioxins? So we've just finished the analysis for that, and we have to do the risk assessment now. And our 27th ATDS is going to be on PFAS, or perfluorinated chemicals. And these are those found in things like firefighting foams. So they get into the environment and in the water table and into the food supply from there. And we've done a bit of work with the Australian Defence Department and state and territory governments in this space on contaminated sites specifically. But the Department of Health have given us some funding to do the total diet study, so we can get an idea of PFAS concentrations for the general Australian food supply and estimate exposures for the general Australian population. So we've only just started planning for that one. So now getting into a little bit more information about our Australian National Nutrition Surveys. So we had a couple of surveys early on in about 1938 and 1944. And during the 50s and 60s, nutrition wasn't of high priority. So most Australians had sufficient food and there wasn't a lot of concern about nutrition deficiencies. And it wasn't until the 70s when chronic disease started emerging and becoming issues that there was a renewed interest in nutrition surveys in Australia. So as a result, we ended up with the 83 and 85 nutrition surveys on adults and school children, and they collected one day of data on around 6,000, 5,000 respondents. Then in 1995, we had a National Nutrition Survey from 2 years and above, around 13,000 respondents, and that was funded by the Department of Health and some smaller bits of funding from other departments, and the ABS conducted that particular survey. And they did that on a 24-hour recall, food frequency questionnaire and some short questions. So that was becoming quite old, and there was a lot of discussion in the Australian arena that we need a new nutrition survey. So in 2007, we did a children's survey. It was realised that, well, children have a lower body weight and they consume more per kilo of body weight due to growth needs. So they're usually at higher risk of exposure to different food chemicals than adults. So the Department of Health provided some funding, but this is where the Australian Food and Grocery Council, so the food industry, provided funding to enable this survey to go ahead. And it was conducted by the CSIRO. And they did that on children 2 to 16, around 4,000 respondents, did a 24-hour recall on 2 days on everybody, and did some short questions as well. Our latest National Nutrition Survey was in 2011-12, again conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Department of Health provided funding for this, but the Heart Foundation also provided some funding to enable this survey to go ahead. Again, it was 2 years and above on around 12,000 respondents, 24-hour recalls and short questions. So then the next question people might be asking, well, what might be happening in Australia in relation to a new survey? Last year, the Minister for Health gave the Department of Health the go-ahead to start investigating a new survey. So the Bureau of Statistics started doing some consultation with stakeholders to say, what should be included in a new survey? Should it be the same as what we did? Are there any new things, anything that we should change? But at the moment, there's no funding that's been allocated to conducting a new survey, and we're going to be having an election this year as well. So who knows what's going to quite happen in that space, but there is an interest in doing one, so it might just be a factor of when. And we were hoping that it might have been 2011, 12, 13, so that 10-year gap from the last one, but we'll wait and see. So I was just going to go into a little bit more detail on our most recent survey. So the 2011-13 Australian Health Survey is our a recent comprehensive data set in the food and nutrition monitoring space. And they had a core content of about 32,000 people where they asked those key demographic type questions. And then 2/3 of those went and did the first component, the National Health Survey. So this is the survey where they collected that information about chronic disease, medical uses, mental health and those sorts of things. So that ongoing 3-year survey. About 1/3 of the respondents did the National Nutrition and Physical Activity Survey. And then there was the voluntary component, so the National Health Measures Survey. So that was our biomedical component. And they did urine samples on those 5 years and above and blood samples on 12 years and above. Also, what was done at the time was the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey in 2012-13. And the structure of it mirrored the Australian Health Survey. So they had the health survey, the nutrition survey, and the biomedical component. And there was around 13,000 respondents in the whole survey, around 4,000 did the nutrition component. And this was the first comprehensive national data set we've had on that particular population group in Australia in relation to their diet and what they're eating. So it's really valuable. The nutrition component of that did 2 24-hour recalls, the first one done in the household face-to-face and the second one was a telephone interview. We used the NHANES automated multiple pass method to do the 24-hour recall, but we had to Australianise it and put in foods that Australians were consuming. We had a lot of short dietary questions, and those were things around salt use. Do you add it in cooking at the table? What type of milk do you consume? Are you avoiding foods for either an allergy or a cultural type reason? And there was also the physical activity component. So each respondent was given a pedometer. They asked questions about screen time and activity levels and those sorts of things. The collection of the dietary data was done by help of a Food Model Booklet. So they had pictures of cups and plates and rulers and wedges, so help people more accurately estimate how much that they were consuming and of what. And for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander survey, in addition, they had pictures of bush foods or traditional foods that those communities might be consuming, so that would help that particular population group estimate what they consumed. And for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander survey, they did sampling in urban areas, rural areas, and then also isolated remote communities. So in terms of Australia, it added like a lot of an additional burden and additional complications in terms of getting out to those remote communities. And for that reason, they only did a single 24-hour recall on that particular population group. We had to determine what nutrients to include in the AHS. So there's lots of consultation with experts and the general public to determine that. And it came down to a priority for those nutrients that had nutrient reference values, where we had accurate food composition data and what was included in nutrition surveys previously, where there are food fortification programs, and where there might be potential deficiencies or excesses in the population. So there ended up being 44 nutrients included in the survey: macronutrients, vitamins, minerals, alcohol, caffeine. It also had to be decided what biomedical measures to include, and they come down to things like indicators of major chronic diseases in Australia. So looked at things like blood sugar indicators, blood lipids, liver and kidney functions, things like cotinine to pick up smoking. Also including things like where there might be common nutrient deficiencies, so looking at iron. And nutrients where the dietary recall might not accurately estimate intake, so things like sodium, because discretionary salt use is very hard to quantify. Also, we included nutrients where the food estimates from consumption might not be the only source, so vitamin D being a perfect example where we get vitamin D from contact of sunlight onto the skin. And also where there's mandatory fortification programs, so we did urinary iodine and serum folate. So there's heaps and heaps of results that have come out of the AHS, and I'm not able to go through all of them today, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of some of the types of information that is available from the survey. And if you're interested, all of the results are on the Bureau of Statistics website, so you can go and have a look at those. So coming out of the health survey, we have information about chronic diseases. And because the health survey is that one that's done every 3 years, they're able to look at trends over time. So things like heart disease, arthritis, cancer, osteoporosis seem to be sort of staying relatively stable in the population, whereas things like asthma, diabetes, and particularly the mental and behavioural conditions have increased over time. In the health risk factors space, alcohol consumption is going down, daily smokers, the proportion is going down, and people with low levels of exercise is also going down. But overweight and obesity is increasing. And just to elaborate on that, you can see that in the groups with the highest proportion of overweight and obesity are in the older adult age groups. And that's increased over time. So in 95, it was just over half of adults who were overweight and obese. And the information from the latest health survey, which was released at the end of last year, now 67% of Australians adults are overweight and obese. In the children's space, most children are in the normal BMI range, but around a quarter of boys and girls are in the overweight and obese range. But interestingly, that hasn't changed over the last 10 years, so that's a positive finding. So we'll keep a look on that as the data over the next few years is collected. This is something that's come out of the biomedical component of the survey, and that was looking at vitamin D deficiency. And this graph shows summer compared to winter. So you can see on the winter graph, where there's a lot more yellow and red in the southern states of Australia where it's a bit cooler, there's more vitamin D deficiency in the winter months compared to the summer. All of the biomedical data were also released per age group, and this again being for vitamin D. And what it's showing here is that the groups with the highest proportion of vitamin D deficiency are in the older teens and young adults, which might surprise some people. From the nutrition survey, they released information about the proportion consuming from each food group. And here the example is non-alcoholic beverages. And in the graph, particularly at the point in the middle, the groups with the highest proportion consuming soft drinks is the teenagers and early adults. And this particular pattern was also shown for things like burger consumption and pizza consumption. So this type of information will be really useful in putting together new national policies or education campaigns for that particular group. Consumption amounts were also released for all of the food groups. And I had on the slide at the beginning, do Australians drink beer? So of course. So for adults, the average beer consumption, the mean beer consumption was just under half a litre a day. And this is showing the breakdown by state. So a lot of the results from the survey are also produced by state, and their Northern Territory have the highest mean intake of beer. It's a bit hotter up there, so you can probably understand why. The consumption data from the survey have been really important, particularly around the mandatory fortification of folic acid and iodine in bread. So we're able to have a look at the consumption information in the bread and cereals group to look at, are people still consuming bread? What proportion of the population? Is it the target group that we're looking at? So this type of information is really helpful to feed into that ongoing monitoring of the fortification programs. Of course, nutrient intakes were estimated for all the 44 nutrients that I mentioned, and this example here is just for energy. But also the contribution of different food groups to each of the nutrient intakes was also produced. Here showing that around 40% of energy intakes were coming from cereals and cereal products. Discretionary foods are those that our Australian Dietary Guidelines describe as those not essential for providing our nutrient intakes and can often be high in fat, salt, sugar and energy. And the AHS showed that 35% of our energy in Australia is coming from discretionary foods. And this number keeps coming up quite a lot in the Australian space, with conferences and things. So it's been picked up on, and again can feed into nutrition policies and things that get established in the future. From the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander survey, the proportion was slightly higher, so 41% of their energy was coming from discretionary foods. This is an example from results from some of the short questions, so salt use in Australia, and this is salt used in cooking and at the table. And over half of the population in Australia have it very often and occasionally. Dietary supplement intake was also collected as a part of the 24-hour recall, and around 32% of Australians consume dietary supplements, the common ones being multivitamins, omega-3s, and particularly in the far end of the graph where the older age groups, the common ones were vitamin D and calcium supplements. We also estimated usual intakes for nutrients so that we were able to compare against our nutrient reference values and estimate. So this is where the 2 days of data come in to enable us to estimate these. So we looked at the proportion of people under estimated average requirements and the proportion of people above the upper safe levels. And just as a quick summary, calcium, there was a significant proportion of the population, nearly 3/4 of females and half of males, within adequate intakes of calcium. Iron, around nearly 1/4 of females, not so many males with iron inadequate intakes. For sodium, around 3/4 of males and 40% of females exceeded the upper safe level for sodium. But when you looked at children 2 to 8 years, more than 95% of children exceeded the upper level for sodium. Looking at folic acid and iodine intakes, up to about 12% of women of childbearing age had inadequate intakes in that space. And when we did the dietary intake estimates for the fortification program, we knew that that might be the case because you can't put too much into the food supply because then the children will be exceeding their upper level. So it was always trying to find that bit of a balance. And when the fortification program was released, we had also still encouraged the need for supplementation in the women of childbearing group. There's been lots of analysis done on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nutrition survey and a lot of comparisons made to the general population. So just some of those findings were around food security, that the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander group was more likely to run out of food compared to the general population. They have a lower proportion consuming alcohol, and that might be reflective of some of the remote communities that are dry communities where alcohol is not permitted. But when they consume alcohol, they consume about 3 times as much. They eat 24% less fruit and 20% less vegetables than the general population. They consume more cordial and soft drink, and they're more likely to be on a diet to control diabetes. In Australia, there's been lots of discussion about added sugar and free sugar intakes. So the Department of Health provided some, and they've been doing some work around this, including looking at labelling options and things like that. And the Department of Health provided funding to analyse the AHS to look at this. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics and FSANZ, who developed the composition data set, worked on this. And the comparisons of intakes were done against the WHO limit, which is less than 10% of energy from free sugars. And free sugars is that one that also includes honey and fruit juices in addition to what we might normally think of what sugar is. So in the table, you can see that there's a significant proportion of Australians who exceed that 10% of energy from free sugars, particularly in that the teenage group, so the 9 to 18-year-olds, about 3/4 are exceeding that limit. So again, this type of information can feed into all those discussions and policies that might be being discussed at this point in time. Another question was, do Australians eat according to our dietary guidelines? So the Department of Health again provided additional funding for the analysis of the AHS to try and answer this question. So again, the ABS and FSANZ worked together to do this work. The main conclusion was that most Australians do not meet the recommended number of serves from the 5 food groups. So you can see, particularly for vegetables, there was less than 4% of the population who were consuming the recommended serves of vegetables. And it only went up to about 31% for things like cereal, grains and fruits. And fruits was more common in children age groups to meet the requirements than adults. And this analysis was done excluding discretionary foods. So where you might have a piece of tomato or lettuce on like a hamburger, that might not have been included. But even when that analysis was done, it didn't change these overall conclusions. So I've talked a little bit about how the Australian nutrition surveys and monitoring data are used in the Australian context and by FSANZ in risk assessments and some of the monitoring programs that are undertaken locally. But I did just want to also touch on the fact that this information and data is more broad, it goes broader than that. It's used in the international context. So our contaminant concentration data, for example, from the Total Diet Study and other studies, we submit that to the WHO GEMS Food Contaminants database. And I know New Zealand also does that too. So it's a whole international database of a whole range of different food contaminants. Our food consumption data also feeds into the international space. WHO have what they call GEMS food cluster diets. And these are based on food balance sheet data or food available for consumption. And what that does in this space is produce 17 model diets to reflect the diets of the whole world. And it allows that international comparison of food consumption patterns and exposure to different food chemicals. For countries that have had 2 survey days or more, they can contribute their data to the WHO Chronic Individual Food Consumption Database, which again has a lot of information from Europe. The Australian data is in there. The New Zealand data isn't because they don't have 2 complete days on 100% of the respondents. And these data sets are really useful for risk assessments internationally, risk management and standard setting at the international level. So I attend the FAO-WHO JECFA meeting, so the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. And we have to estimate exposures to food additives across the globe. So these data sets, and contaminants as well, so these data sets are really important to be able to find out, well, what's the contaminant concentration across the world? And what are the different risks for different population groups? The information is also really useful for Codex and the work of the Codex. So FSANZ being the food regulators for Australia and New Zealand, Codex, to put it simply, is the food regulator for the world. So if they're discussing food regulations for something like arsenic levels or maximum levels of arsenic in rice, they're able to use the data from this particular database to look at what countries can meet that particular regulations and what ones can't. So feeding our data into that international space is really important. We're also in the process of putting together our food composition data for inclusion in the Eurofood data set, and that again is an international data set on food composition information. And from what I understand, the New Zealand data is already in that. So just a couple of final thoughts. Got me thinking about some of the challenges and other considerations that we might want to think about in the food and nutrition monitoring space. And one of those is that we like to look at trends over time. One of the difficulties in that is if methodologies are changing in our data collection methods, it makes it really hard to look at what's happening over time, and you've got to take that into consideration when you're evaluating those sorts of results. And things like analytical methods are changing all the time as well, so picking up lower levels of nutrients or brand new food chemicals that we haven't looked at before. So acrylamide was discovered a few years ago, so that's that is produced in that nice brown colour when you cook toast or roast vegetables. These things are picked up, we've never looked at them before. The food supply is always changing. There's always new products on the shelf. So this is why it's really important to have an ongoing system of food monitoring so we can pick up changes in the food supply. I remember we did a risk assessment for energy drinks when we were establishing the regulatory levels for the substances allowed in energy drinks. And we only had the 1995 National Nutrition Survey for Australia at that time. And energy drinks weren't around or consumed back then. So we had to make a lot of assumptions about, well, how much energy drinks would people consume? Do we just assume it's the same as soft drink? We did some consumer research about would they substitute a soft drink for one of these or would they have it on top of that? So that's a challenge. Funding and resources also seem to be diminishing over time. So, and particularly, so it's harder to collect the data that we need. And particularly if we want those ongoing and rolling programs, those funding sources need to be well established. So it made me think a little bit more about the need for collaborations and whether we need to more actively pool our data and resources and share a lot more in order to make sure that we can collect the data that we need on an ongoing basis. So in summary, we've heard a bit today about the Australian space and that our health, nutrition and food survey data are really important to determine the health of our population. And we use it in Australia for health policy and program development, monitoring and evaluation the fortification programs, and in the food regulatory space quite a lot. And even though the system in Australia is being quite piecemeal, there's lots of different surveys from different organisations and government departments, they're all really important and they're all small pieces of the puzzle that when you put it together, it helps give us a picture of the bigger picture of the population health of Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.